This edition of MacVoices is supported by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter to keep you up on all the latest from MacVoices. Watch or listen to MacVoices straight from your email client. Sign up at macvoices.com/newsletter and stay up to date. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, I'm happy to welcome a first-time guest that I'm a little embarrassed that I haven't had him on before, and it's one of those people that you think about it, and we've tried a couple times and never were able to make it. I met him a couple years ago, now more than a couple years ago now, at Macworld. It just seems like a couple years ago. And then again at CES a couple years ago as well. Kyle Lambert, digital artist. Kyle, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, no worries. Thanks for having me.
Probably shouldn't have said digital artist, because you're not just digital artist, you're just an artist, period.
Well, I think the digital part of things is basically where I live and breathe now. But, I think anybody who's an artist can kind of pick up any tools and really make what they want to make. And, the work that I do now, the digital side of things helps because there's a lot of flexibility in the way I used to create, in the way I create things. But I used to paint with oils and draw with pencils, and I'm sure I could still pick up that stuff if I wanted to. But most of the time these days, it's the Mac and my iPad. So.
Well, I want to put a little bit of a frame around this before we get too far down the line. Folks, if you haven't seen it, go right now to YouTube and look up Kyle's name and Morgan Freeman finger paint. And what you will see, and I'm not going to inlay the video here because of the compression we use here, it absolutely just will not do it justice. You need to see it as it's loaded on YouTube. But it's a phenomenal piece of work that I think was, if it's not your best known, it's certainly up there, or at least it was one of the things I guess that got you a lot of attention. That it is just stunning that you start out, I guess, working from a photo, but to watch it evolve. And the thing that got me the most, I think, Kyle, was that you're willing to share the process. You don't just pop up and say, here, I did this. You take us from a blank slate the whole way through to the finished product that is just staggering.
Yeah, I think for a long time I was always interested in process, and it's kind of drummed into you a little bit in school where they want you to show how you've made something. And I'm always very interested in anybody's creative process. So I used to, I'm a big movie fan, and I always used to watch the making of movies so you could see how they would create these different effects, the special effects. And, so whenever I do my projects, I like to document them in the same way so that anybody that's interested in art can show that. And, when things started to get digital, it became apparent that you could record that process on the screen. So I did lots of speed painting videos in the very beginning. But then something happened when the iPad came out, where the apps basically built in this feature where every brushstroke that you painted was just documented automatically. So it wasn't even like an afterthought. It was just something that, was done as you began painting. So at the very end, you could just, on any of your paintings, if you wanted to, you could just press play. And it would go all the way back to a blank canvas, and you would see the progression of the steps going along. And, at the time I was experimenting with what you could do on an iPad. It was about 2 years into the iPad cycle at that point. And there was an app called Procreate that had basically tried to emulate some of the tools that I was familiar with in Photoshop, but narrowed it down to just the painting tools. So Photoshop you can use for editing photos, and video editing, animation, analyzing data. But for me, it was just the painting tools that were important. So this app tailored this experience just to that. Very simple user interface. But it was powerful enough to be able to do reasonably complex paintings. You had layers in there. You had all these paint brushes that you could build, or the ones that were built in the app that were just like I would use in Photoshop. So I'm always at the point where I like to experiment with stuff and see how far I can push, the tools to create something that people haven't seen before. And no one had really done anything epic on the iPad yet. So I felt like I could push it far enough to be able to do this photorealistic painting. So I sort of spent a little while planning how I would do that. And then what you see in the video is the execution of that plan, this kind of really carefully constructed photorealistic painting where I start with very loose brushstrokes and then, slowly build this thing up to the point where you look at it and it is pretty much exactly the same as the photo by the end.
And I have to tell you, as I was watching it again for probably the 20th time, I get to a point where I think, okay, stop, that's enough, don't do any more, because you're going to go overboard. And you don't. It keeps getting better with each little subtlety, each little shading addition, each little lighting highlight. It really does show. I think it shows two things: not only your skill, but also the artist's eye as to what you see. You see things that I look at, but I never see, and I don't appreciate what that adds to the picture. And that to me is at least as intriguing as how you do it.
It's part of it was planning, because when it's essentially like a month's worth of work that you watch in 3 minutes there, and it's not just a few hours a day. That was a really prolonged process. And when you speed up a painting like that, where there's information just being thrown at the canvas for such a long period of time, when you condense it, it can be very archaic and very confusing to watch, because there's just dots of things flying on the screen all over the place. So with that video, there was a lot of planning into the various stages so that it would feel natural and feel like it was planned somehow, almost like each stage naturally followed the next. So, when I was finishing I would work on the hair, then I would work on the eyebrows, then I would kind of follow a path and reveal parts of the painting as I was going around, just by choosing which areas to focus on. And it took so long to do each area that, it would be quite easy to say, okay, I'm starting here, spend a few hours here, then I'd go down a little bit and just work my way around the painting. But also knowing through experience which bits would be the bits that at the very end you would go, oh, wow. So you would leave that to the very end so it doesn't spoil the experience early on. So it was a lot of planning and, a lot of time and effort. But the goal really was just to, show what you could do on these devices. And, at the time, it really hadn't been done, and the awareness that you could do this on an iPad wasn't really there. And for me, it was really like I'd experienced several years before that people finding my work and going, oh wow, you can do that on a computer. And then obviously the iPad was this much more accessible device with software that was much more affordable for people. And I met people, I think it was at Macworld actually, where I met a group of people who'd seen some of my early artwork, some of my early iPad artwork, and they were kind of like a year into their experience of doing it themselves. And they were all basically saying, I saw your videos and I started playing with the iPad. I hadn't drawn for so long and I just picked it up. And it was at that point where I was inspired to do the video, because I felt like if I can do that for a few people, then if I could do something extraordinary that, everybody picks up on and sees, then it would have much more of an impact. And I think it definitely had that. I mean, it got 50 million views. It was like, it helped Procreate be like the #1 app that year. So like lots of people bought that app and started drawing that year. So
So many things I want to ask you, Kyle, I guess about the process and all. But first off, why the Morgan Freeman picture? Was there something particularly compelling? Was it that the photograph itself, or did you just decide, okay, this looks good, something try to turn into a photorealistic painting?
There wasn't a crazy amount of thought behind it at the time. I think in hindsight, like I didn't actually reach out to the photographer beforehand. I didn't really drew the idea that it would be this huge thing. And in the end, like I had to reach out to the photographer and explain to him that, it was just this idea that I had, and I put this video together, and it wasn't intended to be this big commercial like thing. I didn't make any money out of the video. It was just, I'd done several paintings before where you paint something that you think's cool. But I just basically found the photo online, and it was, I kind of know what images will convey realism. Like there's certain photographs that have a very sharp quality to them with lots of detail and that are lit particularly well. And I wanted to use an image that people could relate to, somebody that, people knew Morgan Freeman. I don't think many people disliked Morgan Freeman. So sometimes you can pick celebrities and it splits people down the middle, and people don't like that guy. But I felt like Morgan Freeman was very accessible, and he was in the top movie that year that I loved called Oblivion. So it was a number of different factors that kind of led me towards picking that image.
Got it. So I want to cycle back here for a second. Just we talked about that you started out as an artist, an analog artist, if you will, using analog tools.
Yeah.
But when did the tech bug kind of bite you? I mean, it seems, in hindsight, it seems so logical because there's so many things you can do in the digital realm that are arguably more difficult in the analog realm. But not everybody makes that transition.
Mm-hmm. Basically, like through school, I was painting with traditional materials. I actually began if you trace it all the way back, I used to spend all my time as a child sat in front of the TV, drawing all my favorite characters from TV, like my favorite movie characters. And I used to sit and draw movie posters, like when I was 5 and 6, I have photographs of me doing that. And I really haven't changed much since. It's just the way in which I've done things has gone through this big journey. So through school, I learned how to be more realistic with the way I was painting. Learned a lot more about color, about how to shade and tone things. And then as things progressed through school, I started to focus more on portraits and drawing realistic looking people. And as time went by, I went through university and learned how to paint with oils, which was like the next stage in that process. And then I actually got a part-time job working in one of the Apple stores in the UK. And it was at that time that I was at university and I was painting during the day, and I was learning how to use Apple products in the evening. I was, teaching people how to use OS 10 and how to use all the different apps. And I was using Photoshop between those things. And it just became apparent one day that I found that we actually had one of the Wacom tablets on display, and I got a chance to play with one just one evening, and it just basically completely blew my mind open and as to what I could do, because I always used to scan in my drawings and play with them in Photoshop, and this just showed me that I could just scrap all of that and do the artwork directly into the computer. So that sent me off on this journey of basically trying to be at the same level that I was with paint, but then in the computer. And then given that I was working at Apple, I started to get access to things like the iPhone when that came out. And, the first came from the App Store, there was a little painting app called Brushes. And I remember my friends were saying, "Have you drawn on the iPhone yet?" And I was like, "No." It's like, "Are you kidding? Like, there's just no way you can draw on a phone like that." And then I just got really curious towards the end, and I just downloaded one of the apps one day, and I did a couple of drawings. I was on vacation, and I think I only had my iPhone with me. I couldn't do any digital artwork, so I just did some finger paintings on the iPhone, and just because of my nature, I just tried to see how far I could go with it. And I did a little portrait, and it was kind of cool, but I didn't think much of it until they released the iPad, and there was a demonstration on stage of the same app that I was using on the iPhone, but now on a bigger screen. And it just completely piqued my interest, because at the size of the device, it felt like it could become this mobile sketchbook, that you could then do all those sketches that you would normally do in a little book and carry it around with you, but you could do it digital, and you got all of the advantages of color. You wouldn't have to carry a set of paints around with you. You can just tap on any color. And that opened my mind up completely as to this device could eventually evolve into being the full package that I could do everything on. So yeah, I bought the first iPad. I did loads of little videos using the Brushes app, and a couple of them I posted online, and they started to give me a little bit of an audience. I did a portrait of Beyonce in the very beginning, and that actually got the attention of Macworld back in the day, and that got me a ticket out to Macworld, and I got to present on stage at Macworld talking about how the iPad could be this thing in the future. We speculated about how, as the power increased of the device and as the apps became more sophisticated, that it could be a companion or even a replacement for some of the more sophisticated packages. And then that's gone ahead and happened now. I started to get hired to do more professional illustration work. So I started to work in the movie industry now, on movie posters and TV posters and things like that. And I still now, since the since the bringing out of the iPad Pro with the pencil, that's really raised the game of what I can do on the iPad. And I now essentially I'm able to divide my projects into half on the iPad and half on the Mac, depending on the demands of each project.
I love the fact that you've
a nice short answer for you there.
No. And I love the fact that so many times during that answer you use the word, I was curious, because that's where it all starts. You know, what can
Absolutely.
I do with this?
Yeah.
And that's something I would love to see, and I'm sure you already I know you have. You've imparted that to young people, that take a shot at it, see what you can do with it. It's very exciting, no question.
Yeah. The number one piece of advice for anybody who's creative really is you really just have to be curious, because otherwise you'll never figure stuff out. You have to experiment with different tools, different processes, different approaches to things. Otherwise, you end up doing the same thing over and over and over. And the idea as an artist is you always want to continually evolve. And sometimes people think of that as just conceptually, that they have to think in new ways, but it's not. It can be, the way you paint things, the different tools that you use in Procreate on the iPad and in Photoshop. I pretty much every time I do a painting, I revisit the tools and just think, that last painting that I did, was there a part of that could have been better if I did something different? And then, every time you do a new piece of artwork, it makes you think, well, I don't really know how to do this, and I haven't really come up with a way. I've never really approached anything like this before. So I'll try some things before I dive into the final piece and do some experiments and make a few new brushes, do a couple of tests, and then, you figure out a new way of approaching something. And then that becomes part of your tool set then. And every time from then onwards, you'll use the same thing. I made a cloud brush the other day that just was, I've always had a cloud brush, but I was doing a painting where I needed to do lots of sophisticated looking clouds. So I spent, maybe 2 days just making different brushes and trying them and questioning what was good about one and not about another, and making a new version, lots of iterations, to the point where I had this beautiful brush where I could just draw, and these beautiful brushes came on these beautiful clouds painted on the screen. And then from now on, if someone says to me, I need clouds in the poster, then, it's a 3-second job, but it's all through that time of experimenting and building these tools. But, that's what's really cool about digital artwork, is you can keep, making all these different things and templates, and, it's just like painting with real paint. A lot of, artists used to develop techniques that they would fall back on for different things, different brushes. One of my idols, Drew Struzan, was a poster artist who did all the Star Wars posters and Indiana Jones and things like that. He used to use an old typewriter cleaning brush, and he used to dip that in ink and then flick it over his poster, and it would create this infinitely fine speckled dust on the poster, which gave it this detail. And it's just what I'm doing in the computer, but using very, very different methods.
So am I to understand that when you started out, when you picked up the iPad, you really had no training? You're all self-taught as far as using Procreate or brushes or whatever. You just sit down and start to work with it, and it happens?
Kind of, yeah. There's, through school, I've gone through various different technical training exercises that you do in art classes. But I think the degree to which I've spent time on my own working, drawing, in perfecting things, what you typically pick up through school is small little insights and techniques and suggestions, little bits of direction. But the actual ability to do what I do is just through hours and hours and hours and hours of practicing and self-critical analysis and things like that. I'm the most critical person of my own work on the planet, and I never really produce a piece of artwork where I feel like I hit a home run. It's always, I always get it to the best that I possibly can. And then, throughout that process, it's the only way you really push yourself to do really great work, is to look at something that you've done and not be able to be impressed by it. You have to constantly seek out the things that aren't good about it. And it's a mindset, and it's hard for some people to be like that, because in reality, you're not a very good human being if you're like that with everybody else. If you pick out every flaw in everything that you ever see, you become a bit of a nightmare to spend time with. So it's a mode I have to be in, where I look at my own work, and you have to be completely honest and critical of your own abilities. And
it can be quite difficult sometimes. It's a very negative mindset sometimes, but you have to look at stuff and go, why is this not good? Why is this not good? Why is this not good? And then eventually you start to bring things up a level. And then if you keep being critical with every aspect of it, eventually it'll be the best that it can be. And as long as you can realize that it's the best that it can be, you then take away that experience and then take it to another piece of artwork. So, and you can apply this to any industry. I think it's how Apple built what they built. Steve Jobs used to be the most critical human being on the planet, and Johnny Ive was the same. And it's a mentality that I learn at Apple as well, and I try and apply to everything that I do. Is that it can be better, and a lot of people give up very early on in the process. And if you keep pushing yourself and have high expectations, you always achieve something that you didn't think you could.
The fact that you want to evolve as an artist, I'm always intrigued by the people and kind of disappointed in people that they don't want to evolve their skills. They don't want to advance their skills. I look at the tools we have available, the things we can do with them, whether they're art tools or writing tools or whatever, and just think, how can you not want to take advantage of this? I envy you your skill with the art creation tools, but at the end of the day, find the tool that's right for you and push yourself forward and learn a little more. I mean, whether we're seeing a big push into programming right now by Apple, which coding specifically, which is great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the idea that I'm just going to sit down and do the same thing I did last week, last month, last year, that really doesn't appeal to me a lot. You always want to do something new, different, interesting. I think it keeps you fresh.
Yeah, it keeps you interested, keeps what you're doing interesting as well. And I think it's important. The technology side of things is very important in what I do, because I'm trying to operate at the top of the top of the top, and in order to be there, you always have to be pushing the boundaries of what you're doing, because there's lots of competition, first of all, but also the clients that I work with always expect the best of the best, and people don't stand still in this industry. It's always needs to be bigger and sharper and crisper, and they need to be able to do more things with it. I mean, when movie posters used to be done, they were just printed on a piece of paper and then hung up in the movie theater, whereas now we've got giant billboards that have to be filled. There's different formats of the poster that need to be done. It needs to be converted into social media content that needs to spread across all of these different layouts. There's animated versions of these things that are created now where they take all the layers of the poster and move a camera through them. So it's I'm always looking at how I can prepare the artwork in a way that's most ready for that process. And I think I'm one of the. I think it's there's a bit of a challenge with technology where you have to be careful of upgrading every single time to everything that's new, just in case something that you're used to breaks, or when you're in a professional situation, you want your machine to be working every day of every week. So I always have to be cautious with upgrading, but I always like to upgrade to the latest thing, and I always like to spend a little bit of time between each project just trying new stuff out. An example would be, I did a theme park poster recently for back in the UK, and I printed this poster, I sent it off to them, and they loved it, but they said that they wanted to add more motion to the poster to make it look like the ride was moving really fast. So I opened up Photoshop, started playing with a few things, and I found this new tool in there where you could do, you could basically plot paths over a layer, and it would do the motion blur in those directions, and you could put multiple arrows and have the blur go in all these different directions. So I applied that to the poster and then just controlled where it would be, and it gave you this incredible motion blur that it was perfectly accurate in terms of where the blurring would be, the direction that the blurring would be going in if it was a photograph. And I didn't know that existed before I got given the brief to make it look faster. So, next time, whenever I need to convey emotion, I know exactly what to do. And that was a new feature, I think, that came out in one of the most recent Creative Cloud updates. So I think it's important to experiment, and, that art works better because of it.
So I'd be completely remiss if I didn't mention one of your other projects that got a lot of attention. And I'd like you to tell us how you got involved with a little show a TV show that maybe some people might have heard of called Stranger Things. Because it started out as whatever it was, and it blew up completely. It was an amazing show, incredible popularity, and of course, it also gave you quite a bit of recognition. And I remember specifically seeing a post by you on Facebook showing the Stranger Things poster. I think it was probably in LA, at billboard size. And that's got to be an amazing feeling to see your artwork up there, billboard size. And to your point, sharper, crisper, it looked fantastic.
Yeah. I think, for me, there was this stage where there was a giant leap that was required in order to go from being this freelance illustrator to working in the movie industry. And I wasn't even living in the United States at that time. And it's kind of difficult to reach out, and the internet's really shrunk that distance in terms of if you do really great stuff, it can travel, and people can find out about you online. So I did. I was contacted by the team that worked on the Stranger Things project, and they'd seen one of my previous pieces of artwork, and they thought that I was a good fit for doing this poster. So they basically just gave me like a few scripts, and then they gave me a few photographs, and then I got like a few rough cuts of the show. And off the back of that, I then created a couple of different designs for the poster. And I worked with this other company that worked in between me and Netflix. And we just basically went through a design process to the point where we had this finished illustration that, that was, the goal with the poster was to kind of be like a throwback to the 80s. So I did a lot of research on how posters were illustrated back then. I looked at a lot of work by Drew Struzan and John Alvin, and there's quite a few other illustrators as well. And I basically then figured out how to paint this thing digitally. I'd never done, there's lots of airbrush techniques that I had to develop in order to do that. And I had to create a set of pencil brushes that really looked like pencil. And the big challenge was how to do that in layers as well, because a lot of the traditional posters were airbrushed onto one board, and there was lots of overspray. So there was lots of blending of color so that, all the characters looked like they were there in the same shot. So I had to figure out how to do that same quality, but also break it into layers so that you could move everything around and create these different formats. But I had no idea the show was going to be this big summer hit. And it was just a giant success, which, for me was incredible, because it was a time where I was hoping to start getting into the movie industry. And, the way that the industry works is that unless they have seen you do something, they won't hire you to do that thing. So I just got really lucky that they found me and took a gamble on me to do this poster. And I just grabbed it by the horns and did as best as I could. And luckily for me, it ended up being the big hit. And my artwork was plastered all over the place because of that. And like you say, it was on billboards across LA. I think it was on something like 30 billboards across LA, which most of which were on Sunset Boulevard, which is like the big billboard spot in LA, which I've since had a couple on. And and the success of the show just grew and grew and grew. And throughout the year, it got rolled out onto all these different platforms. And, I have a cabinet here now with all the different cool things that have been made out of it. Like there's a lunchbox and action figures, which is the coolest thing on the planet. I used to collect all the toys as a kid, so to have my artwork on these things is just amazing. And that really just got me started. And since then, every project that I've got has just somehow come to me through them seeing the Stranger Things artwork.
Well, it has such a unique look. I confess, I'm not enough of a student of movie posters and all. I know exactly what you're talking about when you explain it to me, but I really hadn't thought about how it had sort of that retro look, but the colors are so rich and saturated. The images are perfect. And I'm especially, that's the second time you've said that you have developed plugins, brushes, tools of your own. And I find that particularly intriguing, because I think a lot of us that are not familiar with working on your level think, okay, well, I've got to go and learn Photoshop and learn those however many brushes or tools or whatever. And you're sitting here talking about not only taking those, but also creating your own, modifying them and creating your own. And is that something that is common for, again, somebody at your level of digital art?
It depends really. Like this, I'm very specific about everything that I'm doing, and because of that, there's a level of precision and like control that you only get by making your own stuff. Because I've spent a long time, like I started using Photoshop and I used all the brushes that came with the package, and you reach a certain limit where everyone's artwork looks the same because they're all using the same brushes. And what I'm often trying to do is create a very specific look. And in order to create that look, the only way to do that is to engineer some specific tool that does a very unique quality that when you brush it across the screen. And as you become more experienced with building those tools, I mean, Photoshop's just like insane when you really open up the brush panel and see how many customizable options there are. And for someone who's not used Photoshop, the equivalent is that it's basically like making your own stamp, like you used to do with ink. You would spend a bit of time cutting some kind of shape out. And then once you've made one of them, you can then just stamp it all over the place with ink on there, and you can repeat that same stamp. Well, it's kind of like that. But then imagine you've got this machine that you can attach to it, and it'll do other stuff. So it could rotate the stamp as you're drawing it, or it could, stamp once, then leave a gap, then stamp again, or it could, change color every time you stamp it, or it could. There's just lots of variables, and in the computer, when you know all those different variables, you can then create something very specific that will emulate like a spray paint, for example, or that will look like a pencil or look like oil paint. And every time I do a different project, there's something unique that I'm trying to achieve. So I'll take a brush that I've done already and adjust it slightly, or I'll just completely start from scratch. And I love about it. And one of the great things about Procreate on the iPad is that they've done a lot of that for you. And a lot of other artists as well like to download packs from the web where people have done the work for you as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just really like to know what I'm using, because it's almost like because of the way that the iPad works and with the Apple Pencil and the way that the Wacom tablet works, there's pressure sensitivity. And when you press down lightly, you get one effect, such as a thin line. And then if you press down harder, you get a thicker line. And you can completely control what that pressure gives you. So it could give you like blue when you press down hard, or light blue when you press down lightly. And I just like to know what exactly is going to happen when I'm doing that pressure sensitivity to the nth degree, so that when I'm doing a painting, I'm detached from the process and I'm just engaged in the creativity of it, and I know what the tool's going to do. So that for me happens when I build the tools. But for people that are wanting to get into it, it's a slow process where you can just basically pick the tools that exist, and most of them are really great. Procreate's just got such a great set of tools in there already. And if you want to then take things a step further, there's a panel where you can open up an existing brush and just adjust it. So you can drag a slider and see what happens. And then you go, oh, right, if I drag that slider, things get bigger when I press down the pencil. And then you could then make another brush where that same thing happens, but maybe with a different type of shape or whatever. So there's a lot of density and complexity inside the making brushes. I wouldn't recommend it for someone who's just getting into doing it, but there's a lot of ability. There's a great amount of ability to do, very powerful things if you need to.
So before we get out of here, I know if I don't do this, I'm going to get a lot of emails. But I have to ask you about your setup now. What kind of hardware are you using? I know you focus a lot on Apple products. Are you exclusively Apple, or what kind of things do you use now to create some of the amazing images that are behind you?
So the process that I'm involved in right now is I do a lot of movie poster artwork, and there's a very specific process that I go through to do that. And there's different tools that are better at doing different things. So I often find this difficult to explain, because people are always like, why don't you just use the iPad? Or what's wrong with just using the iPad? And then other people are like, why would you use an iPad when you've got a full Mac setup with a Wacom tablet and blah, 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 blah. So if I could just explain a little bit about why I use different ones.
Please.
There's some there are actually, the reason I use two different devices is because I use each one when I feel like it's the best tool to use. So I use the iPad for drawing mostly. And when I say drawing, I mean actually sketching and shading things in, the things that you would normally do with a pencil. I do that with the iPad because it's a very natural input that I feel it's the best form factor for drawing directly into the screen that I've ever seen. I've used other pen tablets where you draw onto the display, but they're either heavy or warm or not as precise, or there's just typically something that isn't quite at the level that the iPad is. So with the iPad Pro, with the Apple Pencil, it has everything, the level of precision, it has the software, first of all, like the Procreate can handle doing what I want to do on there. It's lightweight. I can sit anywhere and do the stuff. So, and it's handheld and it's very thin and lightweight. So it just feels like working on like a sketchbook or a piece of paper. And that's why I use the iPad for doing the drawing stage. And then typically once I've done all of the drawing, I then throw the artwork back onto the Mac. And then I use Photoshop and a Wacom tablet to then construct what I would call like the master file, which has all of the layer complexity necessary to do what I do. So I'll take all my drawings and break them up into layers. And then each character from a poster will become a big group of layers. Typically, every character's a minimum of like 10 layers, where it's like the base coloring. And then there's different sections that I isolate so that I can control them separately. The hair may be one layer, the face may be another layer, all that kind of stuff. And then the sketch is part of all of that structure. And then when I feel like I want to do like the final details where I need to be precise, I then take that back onto the iPad and I will do like much more sketching work where I use the precision of the pencil to do that. But one of the things I like to do on the Mac is the coloring stage, because it's something that people don't really consider. But when you're drawing and doing like very subtle adjustments to color, it's often difficult to see what you're doing if your hand's in the way. And if you're focusing so closely on where you're putting the paint strokes, you often can't see it in context with everything else. So I like to use the Wacom tablet. It's one of those that sits on the surface like a mouse. And I control the mouse, the pen, on the surface of the table, but I can see what I'm doing on the screen unobscured. So if you're making a very subtle adjustment and you're just like darkening a little area, you can be completely fixed on that area and see the exact change that's happening without your hand being in the way. And as great as the iPad will ever get, you can never do that on an iPad, because the pencil and your hand will always be in the way and you aren't able to really separate yourself from the artwork and see everything in context. So there's a part of that I like to do on the Mac where I'm able to see the whole image, or at least a zoomed out section of it, and be able to make subtle adjustments that are very gradual and subtle, that you can't really see if your hand's in the way and you're working tight in there in a certain section. So that's a really complicated way of saying the whole thing. But I use the iPad Pro. I use the 12.9 with the Apple Pencil. And I currently have a 5K iMac that I use for most of my compiling work. And that I use one of the Intuos Pro Wacom tablets for that.
Sounds like a very nice setup.
Yeah.
Again, there's several of your posters behind you. The Stranger Things. There's a Jurassic Park up there. I realize this is completely unfair, but can you give us an idea of what kind of time it takes? We talked about the Morgan Freeman piece. What kind of time does it take for you to put together one of those movie posters?
It can vary completely depending on the amount of people in there, the complexity of the things that the people are wearing, and also how many environmental things that are going on. But if we're talking about just how long it physically takes, from like if someone was there at a stopwatch every time I put pen to paper, then that can vary wildly. But you have to remember as well, there's a very big conversation that's going on while these things are being created with the people that are paying me to do it. So it's not always just how long I sit down and paint for. It's how long it takes for us to figure out what it needs to be before I even start painting, and then how many times there are changes throughout the process. So sometimes, like for example, on some projects, 80% of the time is figuring out what it needs to be, where you're doing sketches and it's like, I think it should be this, and then they'll come back with notes saying, no, can we try this, this, and this? And then you'll try that, and then they'll go, no, I don't like that either. And then it's like you're going down this road of trying to figure out what it needs to be. And part of that is my goal, to try and come up with this elegant solution that tells the story of this thing. For a movie, you're trying to tell the story of the movie. You're trying to entice people to watch it. You're trying to make this really engaging image, but there are things that they don't want you to do. There are things that, that I'm an artist, so I want it to look beautiful, and they're marketing people, so they want it to sell something. So there's often a lot of dialogue between the two different objectives where they don't really care if it's artistically sound in the same way that I do, whereas I don't really care that it has this certain message in there in the same way. So it's not about caring, but it's about what the priorities are. So the goal is to really find this elegant solution in the middle where it hits all the points that they want to. But I also think it's a really great piece of art. And that's the challenge of doing this. So sometimes that can take months where you're going through iteration after iteration. And then other times you present version 1 and they're like, wow, paint it, So it goes from a sketch at that stage then into like a production line where I then have to produce it at a level that's the quality that needs to be done in a big way on all the different formats. But there's also changes that happen throughout that process too, because they'll start to see it coming together, and then they'll sometimes want to do additional changes. They'll see it in context now and think, yeah, can we add more characters, or can we change that to red, or and that's what's really great about working digitally, is that you have the flexibility to change things at any stage. If you build things with enough layers, with enough sophistication, at any moment you can change the sky, or you can change the clouds, or you can move that guy over here, or make room for somebody else, and then just create a new asset to go in there. So the short answer is that I can create a poster typically within 2 days if I'm like working every hour of every day. But the more people that go into that poster, the more time it takes. And then the more stages that we have to go through to figure out what it needs to be, then again, you're adding weeks and weeks to the process just until it's approved by the people that are paying for it.
I really appreciate you taking us through that process, because it's a process that we often, not often, we always overlook. We go up, we say, oh, we're going to go see this movie. Boy, doesn't that poster look cool? It draws me in, or I really appreciate it. But we don't think about what it takes to put that together, and especially the kind of posters you produce, the sophistication, to your point, the layers, so many of those things, what you're trying to convey. The difference in priorities between artist, marketing, I'm sure producing, writing, all of those things also is something that gets lost on us. And it's completely natural. We can't all spend time looking at that kind of thing.
It's supposed to, though. That's the point. The whole point is that if I create the artwork well enough, people look at it and go, wow, I want to see that. And they don't think about whether it's created on an iPad, or whether it's got nice brush strokes, or, it's really, it all adds up. It's the same with, iPhone. People pick up an iPhone and start using it, and they don't think about that machine that was used to carve out that lens bezel, that nobody really cares about that, but they feel it somehow. They when they pick it up, it feels nice, and they like to use it. And with Apple products, people love to use them, and it's that quality that just emanates from that device. And I think that's the same with art. It's the same with anything, really. You can tell when Steve Jobs used to say that you can tell when the people that made it cared about it, and I think that's it's hopefully what comes through in the work that I do as well, is that people can see that there's an attention to detail in there, and there's a level of quality that shines through somehow, even if they don't know how or why. And I think that's the goal, really. It's not really for people to look at something like, you get into a nice car and drive it. You don't think about the technology under the hood necessarily. You just think, oh, this is a nice car, this drives really fast, but you don't know what it is specifically about that engine, or that's, that the way they manufactured those seats that was nice. I think most normal people don't think like that, and they're not supposed to. It's just sometimes as a creative person, you always look at things at a level just a little bit deeper than everybody else, and that's, I see that in everything that I experience. I see it in, every time I pick up a product, I always feel that care that's gone into it, and you also feel it when it's not been taken. And it's often difficult because you sometimes take other people to task for not being at that level that you expect. But different priorities for different people, I guess.
Yeah, and we both sound like a couple of Apple fanboys, but I know exactly what you're talking about when I go to a big box store and I look at certain devices, whether it's a TV or a computer or whatever, and you just think, that just doesn't appeal to me. It just doesn't look like it doesn't look like something I would enjoy working with. And then you pick up an Apple product, and yeah, I'm sorry, but you pick up an Apple product, and it's, yeah, I really want to see what I can do with this. I want to see how it fits in my life, or what it can do to enhance my projects or just my enjoyment. So yeah. I exactly know what
when it's
you
done
mean.
Successfully. Obviously, not everything that Apple ever makes is the best thing on the planet, but you can see that they've tried to give it that level of quality. There's a consistency to what they produce, and I think that's what I try and do with what I do. Is hopefully every piece of work that I put out there has reached a certain level that is beyond what most people. I always say that, like, if I have the highest possible expectations of my own work, then it's going to be good enough for most people, and that's kind of how I approach most things. If I set myself stupidly high expectations, most of the time it's going to be good enough for everybody else.
One last question, because it sort of folds into that. How do you decide when something is done?
It's difficult, but it's when I stop getting annoyed by it. Like when
when you stop getting annoyed by it?
Yeah, because like I said to you before, there's a mentality that I get into when I'm working on a piece of artwork where it just doesn't look good at any time. And you always focus on the bad things and not the good things. So if I spend an hour on it, immediately my eye just goes straight to that thing that isn't right. And I fix that, and immediately I go to the next thing that's not right. And then I fix that, and then I go to the other thing that's not right. And you go through this process where you keep fixing the things that aren't right about it. And what happens usually is you get to a level where only you can see the things that aren't right with it. And everyone else is looking at it going, it's finished. What are you doing? And it's the same with the Morgan Freeman thing. I went to such a degree of care with that to make sure that every single detail was in the right place, that everyone was stopping me a week before it was finished saying, my dad sat next to me the whole time I was working on it pretty much. And he was just looking at me going, surely it's done, right? And I was like, no. So there's lots of detail left to, and I went way too far with that thing. And, rightly people were like questioning whether it was real or not, because it was just so stupidly accurate and detail oriented. But the idea of something being done is when I've gone through that process and I'm really nitpicking at that point. And I have to really look hard at it I have to go away and come back, and then I see something new. And it's sometimes figuring out how to look at something fresh to be able to do that. Sometimes you'll show other people and go, what do you think? And, not many people can really critique work for me, but sometimes people will look at things and go, what's interesting about artwork is you have your own priorities, and there are things that I think are stupidly important that people don't even notice. And then there are things that other people notice that I don't even register on my radar. So, if I show it to my wife, she might see things that's a little bit different that I've not considered, because she's looking at it as a poster rather than a piece of artwork. So she might say her hair looks a little bit like unkempt, or her makeup looks a little bit off, or, his arm looks a bit weird. And I'm focusing on the shine on the arm, not whether it looks perfect as an arm. So there's different ways in which people perceive things. Everyone interprets things slightly differently. So it's sometimes unique to get it's useful to get a unique angle on something that is different from my own. But I typically know when something's finished because I've done enough of them to know the level that I'm trying to get to. And once I've reached that point, it's more just about the unique challenges of each piece that I personally think need more work. And then sometimes you don't get there. Sometimes you have to just hand it in at the best it can possibly be within the time that it's given, and know to focus more on that thing that wasn't right next time. And that's what keeps you going to make things better and better.
Kyle, talking to you is genuinely inspirational. And I have no aspirations as an artist, believe me. But just the whole philosophy and the thinking makes you want to go back and say, hey, I need to maybe adopt some of this to my projects and my thinking, and even just everyday life. The evolution, the focus. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but you'll enjoy sleeping if you don't go think about things like that. Like, I find it hard to switch off because I enjoy doing what I do so much, and it's very difficult to relax because I'm constantly, I feel like I have this mission to do what I do, and it's great. I enjoy it. I'm very lucky to have something that gets me going like that, and that I enjoy doing, and that I can make a living off. And not only that then people see it and can respond to it, and that you have some kind of little impacts on people. One of the great things about Stranger Things is seeing all the fans that respond to the work. And on Instagram, people post their own versions of it that they've drawn. And when the Morgan Freeman thing came out, hundreds of artists were doing more portraits of Morgan Freeman. It's kind of a bizarre thing that happens where you kind of reach people somehow, but there's also a challenging side of it where it takes a bit of a toll on you because you give everything you've got to it. So I do envy people that have a much more relaxed lifestyle as well sometimes, but it's up to me to balance that, But
in my humble opinion, sitting on the couch is very overrated, and passion is underrated. And if I have my choice, I'll take passion every time, because it pushes you forward and it gives you that sense of accomplishment. And you're right, sometimes you don't sleep. That's okay.
Yeah,
it's okay.
I think all the people I admire, I think one of the things that somebody told me a while ago was that if you want to learn a lot about somebody in one question, you should ask who they admire, because it tells you a lot about what that person values, because they aspire to be like that person, So if someone aspires to be a rock singer, it tells you they're a little bit wild and they like to be on stage and they like to be performing, blah, blah, blah. If they aspire to a writer, they're very visceral and they like to, they're very, they like to read and they like to explore and all that kind of stuff. So I think for me, all the people that I admire tend to be very detail orientated and very driven and wanting to be the best at what they do and care about the small details. And I think that kind of reflects a little bit about me too.
I would agree. So obviously I will have links in the show notes to the Morgan Freeman piece. Where else can folks go to see all of your art, find out more about you, learn about your techniques and your thinking?
I think my website's probably the best spot. It's kylelambert.com, and I keep a good catalog of most of my artwork on there. And there's also, the social media. There's if you type Kyle Lambert into Facebook, you'll get my art page. And on Twitter, it's the same, at Kyle Lambert. And then the other place I post is Instagram, and I was a little bit late coming to Instagram, so I've got Kyle Lambert Artist on Instagram.
There's another Kyle Lambert out there that took it.
There's several Kyle Lamberts out there, I think, but I was a little bit late with Instagram, so I missed out on my handle.
Yeah. Kyle, again, thank you for the time, and thank you for a look inside your head as well as your art. It's absolutely inspiring on every level.
Appreciate it, Chuck.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. You probably have noticed Skype didn't treat us real well in parts of the interview. Other parts are perfect, but I think you definitely will get the sense that Kyle has a passion for this, and I hope you found this as truly inspiring as I did. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our MacVoices Facebook group, and get more out of your Apple Tech with MacVoices magazine, free on Flipboard. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us at patreon.com/MacVoices and join these folks who help keep MacVoices coming to you. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by Cashfly at cashfly.com.